The next session soon. My name is Ronnie at Korea University, a moderator of this session. This session features, as you know, the invited speaker, Professor Adger. As you all know, he graduated from the University of Adger and is head of the School of Languages, Linguistics, and he has written many books, including Core Syntax in 2003 and A Syntax of Substance this year. And today's talk, Applications to Nominal Syntax, is part of this book. Let me make a quick aside. Professor Adger owns a really cute white cat whose name is Lily. In his talk, you have seen the example sentence, Lily bites Anson. Let us see who else Lily bites today's talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a digression. Anyway, I hope you find this session interesting enough to cool down today's heat. The talk will last 70 minutes. Okay, now let us welcome the speaker.
Thank you very much again. So, what I'm going to do today is I'll briefly start off with a recap of the system as to where we were yesterday, just to remind you guys of where we're at, and if you weren't here, so that you are not as flabbergasted as you might otherwise be. And then I'm going to continue on with the remainder of the handout we didn't finish yesterday on syntactic interpretation. And then we'll move to the nominal syntax part in the second hour, I think. So, as yesterday, if you want to ask me questions or interrupt at any point, please feel free. I'm very happy to take questions during the talk or lecture, whatever it is. Okay, so just to recap, maybe I should put this more in the middle. Is that better? I think that what happens is when I turn my head like that, it kind of goes away. But anyway, so just to recap, we were trying to solve a problem yesterday, which arises in standard theories of projection, the labeling problem. And where we got to was I kind of had developed a system where that problem just doesn't arise. So this is one mode of solving problems. You redevelop the system from the start so you don't have the problem in the first place. And that was the tack that I took. And the problem, and the kind of system that we ended up with was one with a number of components. Most of those components are either already in existence, or they're simplifications of components that are already in existence, or if they're new things, they're things that the current system has nothing to say about anyway. Okay? So an important thing we have is rlex, which is the lexicon of roots. Okay? And that just contains things like the root cat, and the root dog, and the root mouse, and the root invigilate, or whatever. Okay? So we have this set of lexical items like cat. And remember, the intuition in the system is that really it's roots that are responsible for being the base of structure building. Okay? So you always use a root to build structure from, and then categories are something that decorate that structure. Right? So what decorates the structure are things from what I call clex, okay? Which is just the set of categories, whatever they are. Okay, so the set of categories are things like noun, verb, adjective, preposition, but they're also things like classifier, determiner, and probably things like definiteness and other things that may be labels of syntactic structures. So n, clue, little v star, etc. Okay, so those are the two kind of basic components that we had. And then we took merge, the standard definition of merge, and we removed from merge the distinctness condition. Okay, so the distinctness condition is responsible in standard theories for ensuring that we don't get unary branching structures. All right? And I just said, well, let's simplify this definition by removing that stipulation, and we end up with both unary and binary branching structures. Okay. And then we had, so those are the things that are kind of responsible for structure building, and partly labeling. The rest of the things that are responsible for labeling are this thing that I call big lambda. We've seen some little lambdas earlier on today. This is big lambda for label, in a sense. And this is a set, this is the Cartesian product of this set, right? So this is a set of all possible functions from one of these to another one, right? So we had things like, for example, end classifier, a bunch of sensible ones, and then we also had some non-sensible ones like classifier to n, which probably never happened, okay? And we'll come to why these never happen in just a second. So why they never happen is going to be dependent upon the universal extended projections. And that's the thing that says universally, for extended projections of nominals, you better start off with a nominal and you build up classifier and then determiner and so on, right? So you go upwards, right?
Can you just write the words a bit larger?
Oh, yes, okay. Or you could all sit closer.
I'm really close enough.
You're close enough, that's true. I'll try to write that. Okay, so the universal extended projections are basically the ideas that you start off. So one of them will be the universal extended projection of the verb. Okay, so it'll start off with V, and then it will go whatever else you get added onto verbs. So whatever it is, O, and then little v, and then I don't know, as, and then whatever the universal extended projection of the verb might be. Okay. Ditto for n. N will be like, you know, little n, and classifier, and numeral, and so on, right? So these are just lists, they're just sequences, which are assumed to exist as part of UG. And everyone, I mean, all they're intended to do is just capture the cartographic stuff that people have been finding out about, right? So what these actually are, I think everyone agrees that we need them. But what they are is empirically determined. Right. Okay, so we have our label transition functions, which can be any mapping, right? And then we have the universal extended projections, and what these do is they constrain for any particular language the acquisition of this. So as you're learning your language, you're like, well, I know all of these categories and C-lex are relevant for my labeling. Which ones are in my normal language? Well, I'm going to be expecting to see ones that satisfy this. Okay? And we'll see a little bit later on today about how we might rule out things like that. Right? Bring things that go backwards. So that will actually fall from the system as well. Okay? Remember, some of the things that are going to be in lambda are also things like D to V star. Sorry, that's not big enough, Freddie, but I didn't leave enough space. My apologies. So D to V star, and I'll say it loudly so you know what it is. And that's the kind of thing that gives you subjects. And again, I've just been assuming that those are learned, although that might not be the case. I mean, it does seem to be the case that subjects tend to be DPs, so there may be, again, some universal principle that requires that. Okay? Or at least restricts it yet further. So UG may have more in it than what's here. Okay, what else did I say that we got there? Oh yeah, and then the last thing that we have is the labeling algorithm, right, which is unified. And if you remember, that says in a structure where you've got gamma and you've got alpha and beta in those structures, then the label of this is dependent upon whether there's a label transition function that will take you both from the label of this to here and the label of this to here. Right? Remember that? So, for example, if this was big V, and this goes to little v star because you can go, it's not here, but you can go big V to little v star, and this would be, say, D to little v star. Since you can do both of them, this is a well-formed label structure. And since these functions don't need to be different from each other, right, this will also work for unary branching trees. Okay? Alright, so that's where we got to yesterday. And what, okay, so, and what that bought us is a couple of important things with respect to the problems we started off with, which is, Well, one, the labeling algorithm is unified, but importantly, it's more than unified. It doesn't really label the kinds of things that Chomsky was interested in labeling, right? What it does is it really labels the whole of the extended projection, right? So this is a labeling algorithm that is a sort of bigger, it's got bigger empirical scope than just the labeling algorithm that we heard about today in Kwang's talk and various other talks, which were really not about labeling whole extended projections, but just about labeling, you know, this kind of structure, that kind of structure, right? So this is within the projection of X. Right? Because of the way that this system works now, there are no functional heads here, so the labeling problem in the Chomsky sense goes away, right? But what I've done instead is given a labeling algorithm that takes you from a root up through the extended projection of that root. So say noun, classifier, etc. Okay? So it does more, I mean this stuff does more, this stuff here you might think, well this looks like a lot of extra stuff, but it does a lot more than the standard labeling thing does, right? I mean, it's a theory of something that there isn't another theory of out there, effectively. And then this is a simplification of merge. These everyone has to have, a set of labels for categories, and everyone has to have roots. Okay? So that's the way that the system is now set up. Now, one of the things that the system does is gives us a problem. It's always good when system, it gives us a number of problems actually. The three problems I'm going to talk about today are symmetry, meaning, and order. You see that we're secretly going back to those concepts that I laid out at the start of yesterday, the concepts of composition, of order, of interpretation, of selection, and so on, right? So I'm going to talk about these three things now. So the problem with symmetry is the following. So imagine that we go back to our verb phrase that we had before, Lily jumps, let's say something like that. So we have jump. We self-merge that, we create a structure, we go and look at root labeling says that can be a verb. Okay? We do the same for Lily. Again, simplifying and pretending that Lily is a root, we know it's not, it doesn't really matter. So we self-merge that, we raise this, we create a larger structure, we label that with, say, D. Okay? And then what we do is we merge these two together using binary merge. Remember, self-merge, binary merge, and internal merge are all the same, right? And then we use our label transition functions and decide that this is a V star. Okay? So we've now got a number of problems. In fact, we've got these three problems. The first problem is, well, this is a symmetrical structure as it stands. That is, you know, there's nothing we've done so far that says that this V is somehow related to this V star any more than this D is related to this V star. We know it is, right? We know that this is an extended projection and this is a specifier, but there's nothing in the system yet that marks that. So the system itself has just created entirely symmetrical structures. Yeah? So that's a problem. And the intuitive solution we're going to give to that problem is, if you're in an extended projection, one of these things, with a category that is immediately above you, then that's a complement relationship. And if you're not, it's a specifier relationship. That's the intuition of how to break that asymmetry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define notions which I'll call I specifier for interpretive set specifier, and I complement for interpretive complement, just so we can keep them distinct from our normal notions of specifier and complement. Okay? And also, you know, we're in the Apple generation here, also not in Korea, of course. So we put I in front of everything, right? So that's what we're going to start off doing, and we're going to see that this is going to be an I complement relation, right? And that this is going to be an I specifier relation. I'll show you how that works in just a second. So these notions of complement and specifier are defined on the structure that's independently built by merge and labeling, right? So the standard view of complement is that it's first merge. and specifier is second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth merge, right? So we can't do that because in a sense we don't have any first merge, right? Things just merge, right? With no kind of notion of what's going first or second. I mean, basically, they're merging, there's no head to be merged. We're just sticking together structures. So we can't adopt the standard notion of complement and specifier, which is first merge, later merges. What we have instead is a symmetrical structure, so we're going to define interpretive complement and interpretive specifier on that structure. And then we use these notions of complement and specifier to solve the problems of meaning and order. Right? So you can almost intuitively, again, I'll give you the picture. So order is going to be easy, specifier is going to precede complements. Right? And that's K, basically. Not quite K, but it's more or less K. So the notion of a specifier is just basically the non-extended projection following daughter, and that non-extended projection following daughter will always precede the extended projection that it's the daughter of. Okay? That's how order is going to work. And then meaning is going to be the reverse of order in effect. Right? So in order we say at PF the specifier comes first before the complement. Right? But in terms of meaning, what we're going to say is that the complement combines before the specifier. That is this V star head will take this chunk as its initial argument, in essence. Okay? And then this as its secondary argument. And that, of course, is, again, standard, really. If we draw this tree as an old-style, ancient, old-fashioned, my God, why does anyone do that anymore type tree? Right, what happens is V star takes VP as its complement, right? And this semantics is calculated first, and then this is composed with this to give you the semantics of the whole thing in second. So that's completely standard. So in fact, the solutions I'll give for meaning and order here are standard solutions. Specifiers precede complements, complements compose before specifiers. Okay? Which is kind of, it's also sort of a nice asymmetry in the way that the PF side and the LF side of the grammar work, right? They sort of mirror each other, right? The notions of complement and specifier give rise to reverse precedence relationships in a sense. Yeah? Which is probably entirely coincidental, but I think it's kind of interesting. Okay. So how does this work then? So let's have a look at the handout. So far, all I've done for you, all we've got in terms of extended projections are these universal extended projections, right? But actually, a universal extended projection is just a constraint. This is just a constraint. It's not part of building the structure. This isn't part of the structure. This is, in effect, an interface constraint on the labeling of structures. Okay? So in terms of how we build a structure, we want to say that a rooted extended projection, right, is going to be a piece of structure that follows a universal extended projection, right? Because we're going to, of course, have to define specifier and complement on the basis of structure, right? So if you build a piece of structure, we can say a rooted extended projection is a series of categories that buys into a universal extended projection. It's an instantiation of the notion of universal extended projection in a piece of structure. Okay? So just to show you that, we've got in 42 a couple of different rooted extended projections. Okay? So actually, maybe I'll talk a little bit about pronunciation now.
I'm wondering why you adopt term com. Yeah.
Why
com. The
Camp as in Hans camp.
why you still keep the term com. Instead of like using head or something like that. Why you
I missing something?
Why? So that's why you use the complement.
Why I'm using that notion at all?
Actually, this
Or the
one
term.
this one does not reflect the what the traditional traditional.
No, I see what you're getting at. Okay, so yes, thank you, and I understand the question. There's actually two traditional notions of complement that are not normally distinguished. The person I know that distinguished them most clearly first was Edwin Williams in his 2003 representation theory book. And Edwin points out that actually we've got, let's take the verb for example. This is standard now. We've got V and a VP complement, right, giving us the VP. And then we've got a little v, let's make this unaccusative. Okay, we've got a little v giving us a VP, and then say I got a T giving us a TP, and so on. Okay? Now this relationship here is typically the complement relationship. Okay? And this relationship here is also a complement relationship. Right? That is, we've got a head and sister, a head and a sister. So that's the classic notion of complement relationship. However, this is what I think you're getting at. This one here is associated with theta roles, with S selection, with C selection, in ye olde days with government, and so on. This relationship here is somehow different than this relationship here, right? But they're both complement relationships in the structural sense. My system doesn't have this, right? It just doesn't have the old style complement relation. That is, it's a system where we can't say, remember we talked about this at the end of yesterday, there's a lexical property of this verb such that it assigns a theta role to its sister. What I have to say is, theta roles are interpretations of structure of something being the specifier of some functional category. Not functional head, functional category. Okay? So I don't have this structure, this complement one. So when I write I complement, I'm really only talking about this one. Right? So Williams calls this functional complementation. And he calls this one, I've forgotten, something like selectional complementation or something, right? So, or embedding complementation. I can't remember exactly what he calls it. But I'm interested in what Williams calls the functional complementation. So I complement here is going to be the equivalent of functional complementation.
Actually, but to my understanding on the diagram, actually the arrow goes the other way around.
Nope.
Compared to the traditional.
Nope. You've got to get the traditional. They're just going to get that out of your head. No, it's just it doesn't. This relationship here, if that's what you're thinking of, is nothing like this relationship here. This is head XP creating HP, creating head phrase. This, right, this relation here doesn't even exist in the standard view, right? And that is a non-head, because that's the head, right? This is not drawn from the lexicon. That's the only thing that is. That's a non-head, and that's a non-head. So it's nothing like this relation. Right? And thematically, it's also nothing like it. Notice that what I've done here is the star here. So this is the agent, the jump. Right? Whereas you never get agenthood in this relation. Right? So these, I mean, I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think it's a bit of a difficult kind of mind flip. Right? Because the structures, I tried to say this yesterday, the structures kind of look familiar in some sense. It's like, oh, V and D, it's just Korean version of this. Right? But no, this is a entirely different kind of structure. Right? Because it just bears no actual resemblance to this at all. Okay? Beyond the fact that's binary and that's binary. That's about the only thing that's the same. Does that help? Freddie and then.
Okay, so in your system, do you also still have to provide a role for the head? Because it seems that there is no headness at all.
Okay, so the question was, just so you don't need to say again, the question was, in the system, do I need to provide a role for the head? And by the head, you mean that.
Okay, so the head is, so in the systems, you never get a head, right?
Yeah, so that's the whole point of symmetry. That's the problem of symmetry.
So
The problem of symmetry is there's no head here.
So,
right?
so when we are, for example, when we're using your framework, do we still have to get kind of terminology like head, or?
I try to avoid using the word head. I actually try to avoid using the word head in general, because, in linguistics that is, because it's got too many meanings, right? So, and I think an enormous amount of confusion has reigned across the world because head has the two following very common meanings, which are often conflated and sometimes confused. One is zero level element drawn from the lexicon. That's one notion of head. That's the one that Chomsky often uses. And then there's another notion of head, which is endocentric element that projects the XP, right? That is the thing that's inside the constituent that determines the distribution of the label of that whole constituent. And so, you know, quite often we just put those together, but they're logically distinct. Now, you could have a theory that says they are the same, but, and in fact, Chomsky's, one little part of Chomsky's labeling algorithm says that, right? An X0 inside an XP is the head, is the projecting element. But they are logically distinct, so we have to, so I try to avoid saying head, although it doesn't always work.
So by avoiding using or saying head, one consequence of applying your series, we have to kind of redefine series like head movement theory.
Oh yeah, we'll do that in a second.
Okay.
Yeah. No head movement. Obviously there's no heads, so we're not going to be able to do any head movement, right? So I'll talk about that in just a second. Yeah.
So apart from the specifier and the complement, there's symmetry in terms of sequence information?
Very good question. So, can I leave that until lecture 4? 5, maybe? So, I mean, it's a very good question, and basically you can't really do C-command here. You have to define command, right, on the basis of dominance, effectively, within an extended projection, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, it's trivial to do, and you get exactly the same effects as we normally get from C-command. But obviously, first branching node is going to give you the wrong results in many cases here. So you don't, I mean, you go back actually sort of to an older notion of command, which is sort of like, well, actually maybe it's not older notion. You go to a certain notion of category command rather than a notion of constituent command, effectively. But yeah, you can define the same kinds of prominence as you normally do. And we'll do that when we look at binding in Gallic noun phrases. Let's actually talk very briefly about some of the questions that just arose with respect. Oh, we have another one. Okay.
Okay, so before you go further, I'd like to mention one thing. So, according to your system, your root lexicon, so that contain functional morpheme, even if you do not have functional head, but you have functional category.
Okay, this is the same question again, which I'll now address. Okay.
So what I'm asking you is that your root lexicon contains like the,
Nope. 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 Contains roots. Nothing else. Roots, cat, dog, invigilate. So all these questions are not yours. The other questions are sort of going in the same direction. So I'll answer them now and tell you how that bit works. Okay. So have a look in 42 on the handout. It's page 7. Okay. So what I've given you here are two rooted extended projections, right? They've both been built up out of taking a root, self-merging and labeling, self-merging, labeling, etc. Okay. So look at the one on the right. In fact, let me draw them. It's probably easier to play with them. So let's take the one with eat first. I haven't put in an argument here, maybe I should do. So we've got eat, which is a verb. Let's take the intransitive version of it, so it'll go up to the star here. Someone's doing the eating, so we'll stick DP in there. That's not here, so it doesn't really matter. We'll bring that up to T, and eventually that DP is going to move up to spec T. Okay. And then we take that up to C. Okay? Now this is a rooted extended projection that we can draw. And I'll show you how the system formally defines this in a little bit. But basically the rooted extended projection is the one in red here, right? Yeah? So it's all of these categories. I'll just draw that. So that's the rooted extended projection built above eat. Everyone with me?
Yep.
Okay. So now here comes your question, which is what about functional morphemes? Where do they go? Well, yesterday we talked a little bit about the notion that, say, that classifier thing is pronounced as S in English. Now T here, right, is normally pronounced as id, or something like that in English, right? But I chose eat for a reason, right? Because eat, id, is not what we say, right? What we normally say in English is ate. Do I have a blue thing? So what I'm going to propose for, or this could be kick, in which case you get kicked, id, right? So what I'm going to propose is that the rooted extended projection, or at least fragments of the rooted extended projection, are insertion sites for phonological material. In fact, they are the only insertion sites for phonological material. So normally we draw a tree, like, we'll write T, and then we'll do some funky stuff, and we'll say, oh, this is really ED, and then something miraculous happens and it hops down to here, or in French, this is like, A, and something miraculous happens and this moves up to here. So that's how we normally do these. We say each head has a piece of phonology associated with it, and you do some funky syntax, or maybe some funky morphology if you're being DM, and you put together the various morphemes, right? And then in order to deal with eat, ate, what you do in English, if you're a DM person, what you do is you take this T, you lower it effectively onto the V. This is eat. This is id. But then what you say is, I'm not going to insert eat here, I'm going to insert id here, because actually what you do is you smoosh these together into an unordered set, and then you insert in that set ate, right? That smooshing is known as fusion. Okay, so that's how DM does fusion. It's a lot of work, my God, right? I mean, it's a lot of work, and you're doing all that work because you've got these separate heads. You've got these separate syntactic entities. You're moving around, and then you're going, damn, you separate syntactic entities are wanting to be pronounced as eat-id. So I shall smoosh you together so you're no longer separate syntactic entities. Right? This system here just says, well, if we've got a root, eat, here, and we've got this rooted projection above it, let's say that this amount, I wish I had a green, do you have a green? Let's take the blue. Let's say that this amount here is pronounced as 8. Right? That is, the phonology 8 is listed in the vocabulary as being associated with a projection line like this. Okay? So this has become a bit fashionable in the last few years, this idea. It's originally due to Williams, again, in that representation theory book. It's called spanning. Right? The notion is you basically spell out something which is non-terminal. Right? So this is what you're doing here. You're taking the projection line to be the locus of where this phonology is attached to. But that's not enough yet, actually. Because actually we're saying that this whole thing is pronounced as 8, but where is it pronounced as 8? Right? Right? So where is this linearized in the structure? Well, the standard view in English is that this is linearized low in this structure, as opposed to, say, French. Okay? So what we do is we say that V star here, okay, is, I'm going to put a little at sign on it, is the place at which you pronounce 8. Now, remember I said to you before, specifiers are pronounced for complements. Let's just take this structure now and say we've got this DP here, this is Lily. Okay, so you've got Lily, right? Specifiers are for complements, well there's the complement, okay? But we're not pronouncing T, right? So then we go down the tree and we say specifiers are pronounced for complement, while DP here has moved here, so that's not pronounced. Then we pronounce 8. Right? And then there's nothing else down here. Okay? If this is French, right? Let's just let's put in an object as well, just so we can see how it works.
What if there's negation?
So if there's negation, right, which will be up here somewhere, right? We'll have 8. This whole thing here. Oh, you want to know what happens to do support? Do support will be at the end of this lecture today. Well, I'll give you auxiliaries in general. If we're in French and you want to pronounce it, so negation's here, right? In English, eat is pronounced below negation. So we get lily, negation, and then we pronounce it here, eat. In French, this at is up here. So we get lily, ate, and then negation, which is what you find in French, right? Lily, mange, pas. Okay? That's head movement, effectively. Head movement is simply the position at which you pronounce the vocabulary item that is associated with the span of projections above the root.
So do you mean that this is one site of parameterization?
Exactly. So the question was, is this a site of parameterization? That little diacritic is exactly the thing you learn when you learn English versus French. Right? Now notice there's no movement here. Right? So there's no internal merge. This is so do you remember when Chomsky was saying a few years back, head movement's all phonological, and everyone was like, what does that mean? Right? So this is a way of implementing that idea. It's phonological in as much as it's about exactly where the phonology of eat is pronounced. Right? The phonology of eat is pronounced in a position, right, in this entire projection line. No head movement, but you get the effects of head movement. Okay? So that's the first part of the answer to your question, which is what happens to functional morphemes. If this was kick-id, you pronounce kick, id, but you pronounce it at here, so you get kicked. Right? So if these have separate things, so with 8, there's a single vocabulary item that spans the whole lot, but with kick, you might want to say you've got kick, id, right? And then what you do is you pronounce kick and then id. But you pronounce that whole thing here. Yeah?
So, in your system, the verbal morphology, so the real way dominate DP, not C command DP, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how the word order between verbal morphology and DP is determined?
Mm-hmm. So I haven't shown you how exactly yet, but just remember I specifiers precede I complements.
Okay, so
Spec and then the rest. And you just do it transitively, right? So, this DP is actually moved in syntax, so it's here, right? So spec pronounced before T, but there's nothing pronounced in T, right? T pronounced before, then this will be pronounced before this, right? But this is going to be pronounced before this, because this is the specifier. This is 0, because it's moved, but then we pronounce that. So you get Lily kicked. Okay?
So spec complement relation is necessary for pronunciation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, crucially, right? I mean, this is why the solution to the symmetry problem gives you a solution to the order problem.
But so in German, I think the complement word order is not uniform, right?
So you mean for PPs versus DPs?
Yeah.
Okay. So PPs, I think, have got a different syntax anyway, which I'll get to later. The German, what you would do is you would just say that, so if there's an object here, you pronounce German here. Sorry. Right? So this would be das, die Mann, der Hund. Something. Right? Okay? So, this does more or less all the things that head movement normally does. This view is not mine, really. This view is an adaptation of Brody's 2000 mirror theory. Right? It's not really Brody because he doesn't do spanning, but it's and he also is lexicalist, and he also is non-derivational. So I mean, it's not really Brody at all, but it's that same insight implemented in this kind of theory. Okay, so that's half of an answer to your question. Let me give the next question, which is, what about something like the or that, or something like that, right? So free functional morphemes. So we've got an answer to, let's do this problem, functional, we'll call them words, right? Or morphemes. Okay, so functional morphemes. So some of them are just vocabulary insertion in the span, right? Some of them are just part of that. So they're just part of span. Okay. What about other ones? So if you got, so this is for bound functional morphemes. Well, actually, just for suffixes. I don't know what to do about prefixes. I have no idea. No one knows what to do about prefixes, so I'm okay. Free functional morphemes, there's two possibilities here. One possibility is that a free functional morpheme is really a specifier. Right? That is that it's really like a noun phrase. It's just a very, very small noun phrase. Right? And when we say, so, let's take, for example, let me do nominal cases. Let's take cat, which is a noun, it's our classifier. Shall I put an adjective in? Let's put an adjective in here, just so we can see how that looks. We'll come back to that later on. And then what will we do next? We'll do a number, and then D. Okay? And let's make the number 3. So 3 you might think is a functional category. I don't know if you do. Some people might think it is. So where does it go anyway? There are two possibilities. One is that it's a pronounced part of this. Right? I don't think that's correct for this, but that's one possibility. Right? So that basically we pronounce up to here as cats. Right? And then here we just pronounce this as 3. I don't think that's correct, actually, but it's a logical possibility. But what might be correct is that we've got a root, say 3, okay, and it's num, it's category num, and so basically it's really a specifier. So some free functional morphemes may be specifiers. Okay? So that's another answer. So some are maybe specs. I think that analysis of numerals is pretty solid, because numerals can be phrasal. So you can say 3,422 mice. Okay? Let me just finish the last one. The last one then is, what about something if we want to say those 332 mice? Mice, cats. Actually, let's do mice, because then you can sort of see how it spans this, right? So the root is mouse, but we pronounce this thing as mice. And actually, I think we pronounce it here as mice. This is where plurality is going to be, right? So we pronounce that whole term as mice, and we've got 3 here, and let's, what do we have with mice? Of course, we have 3. We have blind mice, right? You know that nursery rhyme? 3 blind mice. Okay, so we've got 3 blind mice, and then the last possibility to answer your question is that we've got a fragment. Let's see, we've got a fragment of the functional sequence pronounced separately from the rest. Right? So specs and fragments. So these bound ones are really integrated parts of the spine with the root, and then we can also have fragments. Okay? Now, this raises another question which isn't addressed in the book, so this is just things I've been thinking about since. Raises another question about the order of this versus this. Now, if specifiers precede complements, right? Then obviously you've got spec, So here you've got the head, the higher dominating category with the label, right? And you would specify this as complement, right? Okay. So, and if we look down the next one, this had the specifier the complement. Okay. So to get the transitivity, we say the specifiers before the complement, and then the specifiers for the complement, and so on, right? Which means that the complement is before the head. Okay? So you might just say, okay, well this is like the complement of this, right? So we pronounce this first, then that. That isn't actually part of the theory as specified. That might be one solution to get you the specifier 3, don't pronounce it here, blind, don't pronounce it here, mice, might we pronounce it here. However, I think that this might also be about this relation here, this ordering relation here. I've not really said anything about that beyond this sort of gesture, beyond a guess. Maybe this is before that. Maybe this is a purely phonological relationship. I don't have to write that. That is, the relationship between the and the rest of the thing is maybe just, that order is maybe just purely phonological. And that might be a way of getting clitics. That is, what clitics will be, is there'll be fragments of spans that are not integrated. And then how do they get, they're not integrated in the syntax or the pronunciation, how do they get integrated? They get stuck in by the phonology itself looks at the phonological properties of these things and says, oh, it goes here, it goes here. So these are somewhat guesses. I mean, these are the 3 logical possibilities, right? This, I'm pretty sure about. This, I'm pretty sure about. This one, I haven't really thought it through more than saying, we probably need to say that fragments are pronounceable in order to get things like that. Or if this is a complementizer, for example, you put that. Right, so this is good as that, Lily, not, we're in English, ate the cake. Right? So those are my 3 solutions to your question. And you have another one, I can see.
Just for my curiosity, I'm wondering how your system works for Korean.
Ah! Okay, Korean is
so
beautiful.
I want to look at it.
Yeah, Korean just pronounces everything down here, right?
So we have, Korean is a kind of a classifier language. So
Oh,
a lot
I mean,
of
that's-
classifiers. So K to Mari. So I'm wondering how your system derive K to Mari get.
So again, the issue then,
They have the 2 dogs.
issue again is,
Very classifier, so you can use Mari on there.
I don't know where, okay, I don't know how Korean works particularly, but let's take, we know there are different types of classifier languages, right? So some seem to group the numeral and the classifier together, and some keep them separate. Okay, so let's go for the ones that keep them separate, because they're going to be the more challenging ones.
Yes.
So you would have something like 3 mice things. So this would be either spec, I don't know what it is. Right, that's where the classifier goes.
Classifiers.
Sorry?
Yes.
Yeah, so it could be that, or it could be a fragment. I don't know what the morphology is, right? But if it was Chinese, say, it would be just basically san, ben, shu.
But
Right.
the ordering is different.
So we have a pre-nominal and post-nominal classifier.
Post-nominal classifiers, okay, you want to talk about post-nominal stuff now. So, I mean, you have a post-nominal classifier in Korean? That's really cool, I didn't know that. So post-nominal stuff is really the subject of the last couple of lectures. I mean, so I'm going to really talk about prepositional phrases, which are post-nominal. If you remember, I left you with a problem the other day, which is that prepositional complements of nouns are not complements. They have to be specifiers, so in language like English, they occur in the wrong side. So this sort of makes everything very head final. Right? So, if one is Korean, one should be very happy in a sense. Right? But then it raises the challenge of what happens when you have non-head final structures. Some will arise because of head movement. Right? So Korean post-nominal classifiers, for example, I don't know what's going on, but they could be, they that we pronounce mouse here in Korean at this point. Right? So we get number, adjective, mouse, classifier. I don't know if that's the order. Is that the order? What's the order?
Classifier always case.
Nominal, number, classifier.
Nominal number classifier. Oh, you want number and class, so it goes, oh, well, that's probably just that it's very high then, right? In that case. Because then it's number classifier. But where's the adjective probably goes up higher, doesn't it? So we get, I don't really want to do an analysis of 3 and 9 phrases right here. But what do we get? Because I'm quite interested actually. So we get noun, numeral, classifier. And where do the adjectives go? I don't know. I don't know. I should think about it. I mean, the problem is there's too many potential analyses here, right? So I'd need to know whether these are constituent or not, whether there's evidence that this is higher than this, whether this form's constituent or not. I mean, there's a whole range of possibilities. I don't really know where to start. So. But in terms of answering the basic questions that we're raising, these functional morphemes then and head movement is dealt with in this way in the system. There are no heads, so there's no head movement, so there has to simply be another way of capturing those head movement effects. The way of doing it is you say that vocabulary insertion, for those of you that are au fait with DM, is done over the whole rooted extended projection. Right? So the root sort of acts as the not just as the structure building element of the syntax, but as kind of the anchor for where the phonology of this thing is going to be. Right? Okay, so that wasn't where I was planning to go, but anyway.
David, can I just ask
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Like going back to English, the pronunciation point at little b start, I was thinking of the verb house, but when you have the present tense, sometimes you could alter, the houses. So if you actually the pronunciation done at the point of B, then what actually changes?
You mean, sorry, so the example, the contrast is what?
House and houses.
Okay, so
So you actually change.
Yeah, so there's a generalization which is that you voice the final sibilant in verbalizations of nouns in
Right.
English, right?
But the point, you pronounce the whole thing is just the V not. So before that little morpheme actually,
I don't know. I see what you're asking. So I haven't been clear enough. So we build the tree. The tree has no phonology in it, right? Well, it might have some phonology for the root, I'm not quite sure, but the tree doesn't have any phonology in it. Then we put in the phonology at the end, once you've got the tree. So we've got the specification that this is a V. So if the root is house, we've got a specification that this is no V, right? We've got a specification that this is T, okay? And then what we do is we do our phonological calculation on that chunk there, right? So the way I've been doing it, I've just been saying eat plus T pass would just be 8, right? But I mean, this is me being a syntactician, not a phonologist. If I was a real phonologist, I'd say, this is the original domain of the phonological calculation, right? And then presumably, we do some phonology to get from house is to houses, right? Which will be dependent on this, actually. It's quite nice for that, because it says that the syntax is the thing that determines the piece of phonology there. So if we have the distinction between, see, I don't have this in my dialect, so I don't even know what standard English is for this. But the noun, in standard English, are you meant to say houses for the plural noun as well? I say houses. In Scotland, we just don't follow that rule. So I'm never quite sure what it's meant to be. But you can imagine a variety of English that works as follows. You say the noun house and the plural houses. And you say the verb house, or house, actually. I want to house him. Yeah, I think so. And houses. What does that depend upon? It depends upon whether you've got the V in the structure, or whether you've got the N, say, in the structure. So if you're going to do your phonological calculation on this piece of syntax, you've got everything you need there to actually do that phonological calculation. So this system is pretty good for those kinds of situations, actually. And just to go back to Korean for a little second, I mean, I've been talking about spanning here, you know, pronouncing over that whole range, right? But what Brody's mirror theory actually does is it says the following. Remember I drew it yesterday for you? He takes my up and down trees and he puts them at a slant, right? No, actually, I take his slanted trees and put them up and down. And he has his verb there, and then he has various functional morphemes, various specifiers. And then he has something like I do as well. He has these various categories. So let's say we've got V, little v, cause, asp, mood, neg, t. And what he says is that this is mirrored over here. Right? So you get V, and then what? So, what's the causative affix in Korean? Is there one? K. And then the aspect? I don't know, K, ki, ka, ku. Right? I don't know what they are, right? So, but you see how it works, right? So basically, you know, these will mirror these various functional categories, and you get this linearization. So you could take rather than merge it, you know, rather than pronounce this whole thing as eight, like you do in English, you could just pronounce this agglutinatively and have each separate one, right? And that will give you a beautiful result for head final agglutinative languages. You pronounce this whole thing low, right? But then you pronounce it bit by bit on the way up. Now, the cuteness of that is that, you know, we don't really have another good way of doing low verbs, right, in head final languages with lots of suffixes on them, right? If you think about it, the ways that we have, the classical way of getting a suffix onto a verb is raising the verb. Yeah? If we're in a head final language, we're going to be raising the verb, like, to the right, get this to work. So, if you're remotely Kenyan, your shudder is going up and down your back, right? What you could do instead is you do massive remnant movements to collect all the suffixes in this kind of Julian kind of fashion. And that will do it for you. But actually, the one book that I've written that no one ever cites, that talks about it, right, it mirrors and microparameters, which is CUP 2009, so Daniel Harbour and Laura Watkins, and we looked at a agglutinative head final free word order language called Kiowa there, and we showed that actually any system that attempts to derive this by multiple remnant movements is never going to get the right results. So we use this, this is about Kiowa. So we use this language as an argument that actually you needed to have something like Brody's mirror theory. You have to have the verb very, very low, and then you have to spell out these things in the morphology in this way. So actually, part of the reason my system works the way it does is because I was pretty convinced by my arguments about how head final agglutination works. So actually, this system should work very, very neatly for a language like Korean in its verbal system. Is there evidence in Korean that the verb is high?
Yes.
There is? Okay, so maybe Korean does do remnant movements, but in Kiowa, it can't be the case. There's massive amounts of evidence that the verb is very, very low. Okay, so as usual, we've probably finished, we've gone through a lot of time, and we've managed to look at one example in the handout, but that's okay. All right, so let's go back to then how to define these notions of I specifier and I complement. Okay? Unless there's any questions. Was there any questions I missed? No. Okay, so we've got these notions of rooted extended projections, which I've seen for you in 42, which you can see in 42, sorry. So for example, if you look at the one on the left-hand side, there what I've done is I've said, given an extended projection that will be built above an auxiliary directly. We'll see why I've done that a little bit later on. But this rooted extended projection would be pronounced, for example, as would, right? You'd have will plus modal plus past t, and you get something like would. Okay. So basically what UG does then is it allows for, in a particular language, a rooted extended projection to be any subsequence of the universal extended projections instantiated in a piece of structure. Alright? So that's just what I've written down there. Once we've got rooted extended projections, we can define I specifier and I complement very straightforwardly. And I've given you the definition I gave you in the book. Since then, I think I can simplify it, but let's just continue with what's in the book. So basically, I've given you these two different cases. Okay, you'll see why I've given them in two different cases in a second. Basically, we say that beta. So if we've got a unary projecting structure, we can collapse these, but I won't here because it's kind of easier. So we've got a unary projecting structure like this. This is trivial, right? That is an I complement of that if there's a rooted extended projection such that that is lower in that projection than that is. Right? So in this case here, V will be an I complement of O. Right? This is a rooted extended projection. Universal extended projection says that V is lower than O. Oh look, in the rooted extended projection, V is lower than O. Right? It's incredibly trivial, and it just basically says that's what the I complement relation is. The I specifier relation, well, in a binary labeled structure, we say that basically it's exactly the same. Right? We've got two cases, like this for example, and we say that in this one we've got that relationship. That relationship doesn't hold in this one, therefore that's the I complement. Okay?
Just for clarification, maybe I was not paying attention to submission, but what does I stand for?
Interpretative. Or interpretive. Interpretative. Yeah. Anyway, the idea is it's the so and actually what I mean by interpretation here is not meaning. I mean it's syntactic interpretation. It's interpretation qua complement or qua specifier. Right? What it is, I mean that's almost like the notion of grammatical category. Right? That's all that's left of sort of the notions of subject and object and so on is that. Right? It's basically the structure. I mean. No, it's a structural relationship that depends upon category. Right? All my structural relationships are really dependent upon category as well as structure. Yeah.
What will be the difference between X bar theory before merge? I mean, it can be unary as well.
Sorry, say again?
Just X bar theory without merge.
X bar theory without merge.
It can be unary as well, right?
Yeah.
And then it has a specifier.
But it's headed. So the difference between my system and X bar theory is just the fact that X bar theory says everything is headed, and I say ain't no heads. So I think that if my system is anything, it's minus X bar, right? Right? Because there's no bar and there's no phrasal level and there's no heads. Right? So yeah, it's not very X bar actually. Okay, so that's how we do the complement relationship, and then the specifier relationship is basically if you're binary and you've got an I complement, the specifier is the other thing. Right? So that's what it says there. Okay, so those are pretty trivial definitions, right? But crucially they depend upon whether in an actual structure you've got this extended projection relationship. So complement versus specifier depend upon the way that the extended projection relationship is instantiated in structure. Okay, that's what they are. And then I'm given the following general. This is like an interface constraint, right? It says the following in 45. I call it FILS, full interpretation of label structures, and it just says in a label structure you better be able to uniquely assign syntactic relations to all the mother daughter pairs. So it just says, anytime you build a structure, you better be able to have a syntactic relation there. Right? No missing things out. It's full interpretation basically, right? But don't miss things out. Everything's going to be able to have a structure. Okay, now this system, which I think is fairly, symmetry forces us to be able to define these two things. We define these two things on the basis of the stuff we already have. So, I haven't said anything really, in a sense. I haven't sort of added anything to the system. I've just said there's a configuration of the system that allows us to determine this asymmetry. And it's really important to determine an asymmetry in the syntax because the interface systems, PF and LF, they require there to be an asymmetry, right? That's why you have order in PF and why you have, different composition in LF. Okay. It turns out that this is kind of a neat system in the default. Well, I don't know. I was terrified when I first discovered the consequence of this system, and I was even more terrified because I discovered the consequence of this system about 25 minutes before I was about to give a class in Richie Kane's advanced syntax seminar at NYU, where Richie was sat in the front row, and the consequence of my system is there's no roll-up remnant movement. So, and I found this out literally 25 minutes before the class. So I was a bit worried. But I've now decided it is a real plus. Okay? And I'll show you how it works in just a second. Okay, so let's run through the possible cases. Okay, so in example 46, I've given you a little tiny baby unary tree there. If you've got a variable like x or y, that signifies the various x's are in the same extended projection. A y is in a different extended projection, right? And if you've got the numbers, that just tells you the height of the thing in the extended projection. How far away you are from the category B or N, okay? So this doesn't mean anything, this is just for me to show you abstract structures that will be instantiated. So obviously 46 and the two trees in 46 are going to be fine, right? Two trees in 46 basically say, well, you've got x5 above x3, x5 and x3 are in the same extended projection, x5 is above x3 in that extended projection, and oh look, in the structure, x5 is above x3. So that satisfies the requirement that x3 is a complement of x5. Okay? Actually, if you just recurse the category, if we have num, for example, I haven't ruled that out. It should be absolutely fine, actually. And that will also say that the lower one is a complement of the higher one. That is a decision I took in the book, and I'm reconsidering it now. I think this, I'm not sure. I think this might be actually how I want to do adjuncts, but I don't really know. So at the moment, this is just a complementation relationship that's defined by the system that I've given. Okay? If you have a look at 47, okay, then 47 violates fills, right? Because in 47, they're both in the same, 47 on the left, they're both in the same external projection, but x3 is above x5 in that, x3 is below x5 in the extended projection, but it's above x5 in the rooted structure. So, we can't assign I complement to it, and we can only assign I specifier if we can assign I complement. So we can't assign I specifier, so that means that we can't assign syntactic relations, so we violate the label structures. So do you remember earlier on I was going, well, what about this label transition function, classifier up to noun, right? Well, that's in lambda, because everything's in lambda, but actually fills here will mean that that's never ever instantiable in any structure, right? Classifier up to noun. So that will never find its place in the set of label transition functions that any individual has in their I language, right? Okay, so, the way I set this up, lambda here just gives you all of the possible label transition functions, and then it turns out that a bunch of them are going to be okay, and a bunch of them are going to be ruled out because we'll never be able to use them to successfully assign grammatical relations, right, specifier and complement, but every structure has to have a grammatical relation attached to it. Okay? So, in 47, we see the same thing. It's actually slightly different, but broadly it's the same. We've got things in two different extended projections. It's only a unary branching structure, okay? And therefore, we can't assign complement to it. We can't assign I complement there. But we can only assign I specifier if we assign I complement, so we can't assign I specifier, and therefore 47 on the right is also ruled out. Okay? What about 48? 48 is ruled out because everything's in different external projections, and therefore we can't do anything with it. Right? So this is a kind of headedness, but it's not headedness as we know it. Right? It's headedness that says, you better be, if I look at you as a local tree, you better be well formed as part of an extended projection that stems from a root at some point. That's what it does. So, we'll never get something like, I don't know, little v star, I don't know, asp, and none. Right? Well, then little v star asp when we say projection, that's dead for degree. Right? So assuming that's in the nominal term projection, that's in the adjectival one, and that's in the verbal one, we can't have that. Just as well, because...
So if we understand your field is a kind of constraint on this lambda,
it's not constrained on lambda, it's constrained on structures, but it means that so the way I think of lambda is you start off with the whole lot,
yes.
right? And you're a little baby, and you're going, oh God, there's all this blethering around me, and I've only got UG. Well, I've got this huge big lambda thing, right? Like now, so can I use that big lambda thing to assign structures, to assign grammatical relations, so I can understand what these things mean? Oh no, I can't do that with, say, classifier to noun. So it just dies in that structure. It's like cell death. We are actually the result of something like 3% of the cells we were born with, right? This tiny amount of cells we were born with survive into our later body. All the rest die off. So it's like that in a sense. It just dies. It's still in lambda, but it's just not accessible. Okay, then let's run through 49. 49 is a little bit like 48. So in this situation, we've got same extended projection, but the things that are lower in the tree are all higher in the extended projection. Right? So that rules out. Yeah?
So CP can be embedded in the bar. So this means that UEP has a system that V is higher than C, right?
So the question is embedding. So what happens when we have embedding, right? But remember, all of my embedding is in specifier relationships.
Okay.
Right? So, if this was think, and this was, it's probably not O, imagine it was O, and this is O, C, then we have that structure.
Okay.
Right? Yeah?
So CP is a specifier.
Everything, all arguments have to be specifiers. In fact, nothing can be a complement unless it's in an extended projection. Yeah?
But CP can be embedded
As a specifier.
As a specifier.
complement.
It's probably not quite O, because the relationship between verbs of thinking and the propositional complements are not exactly the same as relationships between, say, kick and an object. Right, so there's some very interesting work recently by Kieran Moulton, who's done some stuff on how CPs get embedded. And he actually says that there's sort of adjuncts of things that are in here, right? So I don't know if you want to buy that, but there's sort of propositional adjuncts. So I don't know exactly what the real analysis is, but this is the toy analysis I would adopt for these.
So in your analysis, C always higher than V.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, of course it is. Yeah. Oh yeah, this is going to come up, right? Well spotted. This is going to come up in just a second. Okay, so in 50 is lovely, right? 50 is we've got some x4 above an x3, and we've got a specifier, which is a y10. We can assign the complement relationship between x4 and x3, and the specifier relationship, therefore, to y10. Okay. Ditto for the recursive version on the right-hand side of 50. And then, if we look at 51 here, we've got x4 is above x3, so we can assign the complement relationship. And now x10 is in the same extended projection, but it's higher in that extended projection, so it can't be the complement, but it can be the specifier. Okay? So that would be something like, a DP daughter inside a DP inside an access. Okay. Now, what about the cases where both of the daughters are in the same extended projection as the mother, they both are lower in that extended projection. Right? So have a look at 52, and I'll draw it on the board actually. Am I going over time?
Yes.
Well, why didn't you tell me?
Sorry.
I mean, am I way over time? No, okay. Let me just finish this one, and then we'll stop for a break. Yeah, because we're more or less finished the system. Okay, so in this case here, x5 over x3 over x4. Okay. Now this tree is kind of problematic, right? Because this isn't an extended projection relationship, and this isn't an extended projection relationship, right? But remember, broadly, Phil says we better be able to uniquely assign I specifier and I complement here. So we're not actually going to be able to do that, right? Because we could assign this an I complement relationship and say that's an I specifier relationship. But we can also say that that's an I complement relationship and that's an I specifier relationship. So there's no unique assignment of I complement and I specifier. So the interfaces cannot determine an asymmetry. The thing is symmetrical again. So actually, and this goes a bit back to your question about is CP always higher than, say, VP? Yeah. So actually what this rules out are all sorts of cases where we have something low, two things lower in an extended projection. So we'll rule out, for example, say DP with, say, I don't know, num-P and then classifier, where this is, say, a specifier, then that's the complement. And that sort of seems correct, right? I mean, those are structures that we don't tend to have, so we tend to take specifiers to be higher. Right? And I don't think, I mean, okay. So that's one case, and this is not a case I'm going to concentrate on. Right? The case I'm going to concentrate on is the other way of deriving that, which would be to say, well, actually this goes x4 to x3, and then down here's a root of some kind. And what we do is we take this and we merge it here. As we move it to the specifier position. Right? But now that's definitely impossible in the system. Right? Because that's an I complement relationship, and that's an I complement relationship. Right? And we're done. But we have to uniquely determine I complement relationships. They can't both be I complements under the system, and therefore we can never have, this is roll-up movement, right? We can never have roll-up movement. Okay? So the system, by its very nature, rules out all roll-up movement. So you can see why I was somewhat nervous about finding this out 25 minutes before Kane's class, and then presenting it to Kane's class. Hi Richie, there's no roll-up movement. Your last 15 years of work you've thrown away. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. We'll have a break. I'm worried we're never going to get to nominal syntax. Oh God, maybe nominal syntax is tomorrow. I think we'll be okay. Okay, and then we'll continue with where we left off. So go and have a think about that, and then come back to questions.
Okay. I'm sorry for not telling you.
No, that's all right. It's because you were so entranced.
So interesting.